The town of Black Hollow, Montana has always been known for one thing. People there believe that some families inherit land, while others inherit sins. For more than 70 years, the Whitmore family owned almost everything around the town. Miles of farmland, old warehouses, coal businesses, logging companies. Even the oldest mansion standing near Raven Creek belonged to them. Everyone respected them. Everyone feared them. No one ever questioned how they became so powerful. Because every old resident of Black Hollow knew one rule: never ask about the abandoned Hawthorne estate. The mansion had been empty for decades. No lights, no visitors, no owners, just silence. The strange part was that the property legally belonged to the Whitmore family, but no member of the family had ever lived inside it, not even for a single night. Every year someone would suggest selling the mansion. Every year the family refused. No explanation, only silence. This story was shared by a man named Ethan Whitmore. He claimed everything happened to his family between 1958 and 1966. According to Ethan, these events were never reported to the police, never written in newspapers, never spoken about outside the family. His grandfather carried the secret until the day he died. Only then did he reveal the truth. Before we continue, there is something you need to understand, because without knowing the family, everyone will become confused later. The Whitmore family was led by Charles Whitmore, a respected businessman who controlled farming, timber, and transportation across several counties. Charles had 5 sons: Daniel, Samuel, Robert, Thomas, and Edward. Daniel and Samuel were the oldest. Robert was the middle son. Thomas and Edward were the youngest. Charles also had 2 younger brothers. Victor never married. George had a wife and 2 daughters. Both brothers spent their entire lives helping Charles build the family empire. They handled business, land records, money, everything. When Charles suddenly died at the age of 57, the entire business passed to Daniel and Samuel. Robert was studying business administration in Chicago. Thomas and Edward were still in college. Victor and George stayed behind to guide the 2 older brothers through every decision. Within 3 years, the Whitmore business became even bigger. They entered construction, concrete, steel storage, rail shipments. Money poured in faster than ever before. Then Robert graduated and returned home. His brothers welcomed him into the business. Everything seemed perfect, until one simple decision changed every life forever. The company needed a much larger warehouse. Their old storage buildings could no longer hold all the construction equipment arriving every week. They searched across the county for a new property. Then Daniel remembered something. Outside Black Hollow, hidden behind dead oak trees, stood the abandoned Hawthorne estate. A massive mansion with dozens of empty rooms, large halls, stone basements, enough space to store almost anything. Legally, the mansion already belonged to the Whitmore family. Years earlier, the original owners had disappeared, leaving the property behind. At least that was the story everyone believed. Daniel smiled. Why waste money building another warehouse when an entire mansion was already sitting empty? The very next morning, Daniel, Samuel, and Robert drove to the estate. Rust covered the iron gate. The chains broke the moment they pulled them apart. The front door groaned as if it had not been opened for decades. Dust floated through the cold air. Broken furniture still stood inside. Old paintings watched them from cracked walls. But despite its age, the mansion was beautiful, almost untouched. Robert looked around and laughed. This place is bigger than half our warehouses combined. Daniel agreed immediately. They would clean the house, convert several halls into storage, turn one wing into a business office. It was the perfect location. Then Daniel noticed something strange. Deep inside the mansion, one entire section of the building had been hidden behind a thick wooden wall. It looked newer than the rest of the house, almost as if someone had built it later, just to block whatever stood behind it. Daniel walked closer. He knocked on the wooden boards. Something echoed from the other side. There was empty space behind it. A very large empty space. Daniel smiled again. If we remove this wall, we can double the storage area. The workers can start tomorrow. None of the brothers saw any problem until Victor and George returned home that evening. The moment they heard about the mansion, both men turned completely pale. Victor stood up so quickly that his chair crashed onto the floor. His voice trembled. Do not touch that house. Find another warehouse. Any other place. George nodded without saying a word. His face had lost all color. Robert frowned. Why? It is legally ours. Nobody lives there. Victor avoided everyone's eyes. Some places should remain closed forever. Daniel laughed softly. We are businessmen, uncle, not children afraid of ghost stories. Tomorrow morning the workers will begin renovating the mansion. Nothing is going to stop us. Victor slowly looked toward George. Neither of them argued anymore. but the fear in their eyes had become impossible to hide. And for the first time, Robert realized his uncles were not afraid of the mansion. They were afraid of something waiting inside it. The renovation began at sunrise. Workers cleared broken furniture. Dust covered every hallway. Windows were opened after decades. Fresh air filled rooms that had remained sealed for years. Everything moved faster than expected. Within 2 days, the front halls looked completely different. Daniel walked through the mansion with a smile. This place will become the biggest warehouse we have ever owned. Robert agreed. Even the workers admitted the building felt strangely well preserved, almost as if someone had secretly cared for it all these years. Then the workers reached the wooden wall. The same wall Daniel wanted removed. Victor arrived just before the work began. His face looked exhausted. He stood directly in front of the wall. Please do not break this. Use the rest of the mansion. Leave this section alone. Daniel crossed his arms. You still have not told us why. Victor stayed silent. George finally spoke. Some doors are locked for a reason. Daniel shook his head. This is our property. Nobody gets to tell us which rooms we can use. He looked at the workers. Start tearing it down. The first hammer struck the wood. Nothing happened. The second blow echoed through the mansion. A strange cold wind suddenly moved through every hallway. One worker stopped. Did someone leave a window open? Another worker looked around. Every window was closed. Daniel ordered them to continue. Piece after piece the wooden barrier collapsed. Behind it stood a long-forgotten hallway, covered in thick dust. No footprints, no signs of life. At the very end stood an enormous black wooden door. Its surface was covered with strange carved symbols. A heavy iron lock hung from the handle. The metal looked untouched by rust, as if time itself had refused to age it. Nobody spoke. Even the workers felt uncomfortable. Robert slowly stepped forward. This room has been hidden on purpose. Daniel examined the lock. Who has the key? Nobody answered. He turned toward Victor. You knew this room existed. Where is the key? Victor immediately shook his head. I do not have it. George gave the same answer. The key disappeared many years ago. Forget this room exists. Daniel stared at both uncles. For the first time he noticed sweat running down Victor's forehead. Even though the weather was cold, Robert quietly watched both men. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. Daniel finally smiled. Fine. If there is no key, then we do not need one today. We have enough space already. We will finish the warehouse first. The locked room can wait. Victor closed his eyes with relief. He took a slow deep breath, almost as if his life had just been saved. Robert noticed every second of it. Why would a locked room frighten two grown men this much? That question stayed in his mind. Weeks passed. Business exploded. The warehouse became the busiest building the family owned. Construction materials arrived every day. Trucks came and went from sunrise until late evening. The business doubled its profits. Months became years. Robert married. Daniel married. Samuel married. Thomas and Edward finished college and joined the family business. Now all 5 brothers worked together. Life seemed perfect, until one afternoon. Daniel stood inside the warehouse studying shipment records. He looked around at the overflowing storage. Every room was packed. Every hallway was full. There was only one empty place left, the sealed room behind the iron door. Daniel looked toward the hidden hallway, then quietly smiled. I think it is finally time to open that room. At the exact same moment, Victor dropped the glass he was holding. It shattered across the floor, and his terrified eyes slowly turned toward Daniel. Victor stood frozen. For several seconds he could not speak. George slowly walked toward Daniel. Please listen to me one last time. You already have enough money, enough land, enough success. Leave that room exactly the way it is. Daniel looked confused. You have been saying the same thing for years. At least tell us why. George lowered his head. Some truths destroy families. Not everyone is meant to know them. Samuel stepped forward. If there is really something dangerous inside, then we deserve to know. Victor looked at all 5 brothers. His lips trembled. Then he whispered, if you open that room, nothing in this family will ever be the same again. Daniel sighed. I respect both of you, but fear cannot run a business. Tomorrow morning we break the lock. Victor turned around without another word. George followed him. Neither man looked back. That night Robert could not sleep. Something about his uncles felt different. They were not pretending. They truly believed something terrible was waiting behind that door. The next morning the entire family gathered inside the mansion. Several workers stood nearby with heavy tools. The old hallway felt colder than the rest of the house, even though it was summer outside. Every breath turned faintly visible in the air. One worker touched the iron lock, then quickly pulled his hand back. It feels freezing. Daniel grabbed a steel hammer. Stand back. One powerful swing echoed through the hallway. The lock barely moved. Another strike. A crack appeared across the metal. The third blow shattered it completely. The heavy lock crashed onto the floor. For a moment, nobody moved. Daniel slowly pushed the door. It opened with a long, painful sound, as if the room itself had been holding its breath for decades. A wave of stale air escaped into the hallway. The room was enormous, far larger than anyone expected. Dust covered every corner. Old wooden shelves lined the walls. Ancient books, broken furniture, religious paintings. Everything remained exactly where someone had left it many years ago. Thomas smiled. Looks like we found free storage space. Everyone relaxed, except Robert. He could not explain why. But the moment he stepped inside, a strange pressure settled across his chest, almost like someone was silently watching him. Daniel laughed. See, nothing happened. Victor and George stood outside the room. Neither of them entered. Neither of them even looked inside. Edward wandered toward the far corner. There sat an old cedar chest, covered with thick dust. Its brass lock had already rusted away. What do you think is inside? Samuel joked. Maybe old family treasures. Edward knelt beside the chest. Victor suddenly screamed from the hallway. Do not touch it. His voice echoed through the mansion. Everyone turned toward him. It was the loudest anyone had ever heard him speak. Edward looked surprised. It is only a box. George almost begged. Please leave it closed. Daniel frowned. This house belongs to us now. Everything inside belongs to us too. Edward smiled and lifted the lid. Inside lay several old journals, bundles of dried herbs, a black leather satchel, and beneath it, 2 small copper urns, wrapped carefully in faded white cloth. Resting beside them was something none of them expected. A human-shaped figure, made from dried clay and dark thread. A long black metal spike had been driven straight through its chest. The metal looked unlike ordinary iron. Its surface shimmered with strange silver patterns. Edward slowly picked it up. What kind of antique is this? Victor shouted again. Put it back, right now. But curiosity was stronger than fear. Edward gripped the strange spike and slowly pulled it out of the doll. The moment the spike left the clay, every window inside the mansion slammed shut at the exact same second. The entire building shook once, then complete silence returned. No wind, no voices, nothing. Edward laughed nervously. Probably just old wood settling. He slipped the strange spike into his jacket pocket, closed the chest, and walked away. Behind him, Victor collapsed into a chair. His face had become completely white. George whispered only 6 words. God help every one of us. For the next 3 days, nothing unusual happened. The warehouse remained busy. Deliveries arrived on time. Workers laughed. Business continued exactly as before. Daniel even joked that their uncles had frightened themselves for no reason. Slowly everyone forgot about the locked room, except Victor. Every morning he walked to the mansion. He stood outside the hidden hallway, stared toward the closed room, then quietly left without saying a word. On the 4th evening, a large shipment of steel beams arrived much later than expected. The inventory had to be completed before sunrise. Normally several employees handled the paperwork, but heavy rain forced most of them to leave early. Edward looked at the unfinished records. I will stay tonight. I can finish everything myself. Robert immediately offered to help, but Edward smiled. Go home. Your wife is waiting. I will be fine. Besides, I have stayed here overnight before. Nothing ever happens. Victor heard the conversation, his face filled with panic. Number, do not stay here after dark. Finish the work tomorrow. One night will not hurt the business. Edward laughed. You really believe this house is haunted? Victor stepped closer. His voice became unusually serious. Listen to me. The night does not belong to us inside this place. Leave before sunset. Edward respectfully nodded, then waited until everyone drove away. As darkness covered Black Hollow, only one light remained inside the warehouse. Edward sat alone at the office desk. Stacks of invoices surrounded him. Outside, rain hit the windows. The old mansion creaked with every gust of wind. Hours passed peacefully. Around midnight, Edward suddenly stopped writing. He felt something strange. Someone was standing behind him. He remained still, listening. Nothing. He slowly turned around. The room was empty. He smiled to himself. Lack of sleep. That is all. He returned to the paperwork. A few minutes later, the feeling returned, this time stronger. Not only did it feel like someone stood behind him, it felt as though something was leaning over his shoulder, watching every word he wrote. Edward spun around again. Still nothing. But just before he faced forward again, he heard it. A soft sound, like someone running across the wooden floor. Only a few feet away, he grabbed the old lantern, walked into the hallway. Every room stood empty. Every door remained closed. He searched the entire first floor. Nothing. Trying to calm himself, he walked toward the clay water jug near the entrance. As he poured himself a drink, a deafening crash exploded outside. The sound was so powerful, it shook the glass in his hand. Edward rushed to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped into the rain. One of the giant branches from the ancient oak tree had fallen into the courtyard. The branch was impossibly thick, far too heavy to snap on its own. Edward stared at it in confusion. Then another sound echoed from inside the mansion. A loud wooden thud. Something had fallen. He locked the front door, raised the lantern, and followed the noise. Step by step, the sound led him toward the hidden hallway. His heartbeat grew faster. The cold became unbearable. When he reached the sealed room, he froze. The cedar chest, the same chest they had placed safely on the highest shelf, now lay upside down in the middle of the floor. Its lid hung open. Edward slowly walked closer, holding the lantern with trembling hands. The two copper urns had shattered. Gray ashes covered the wooden floor. The old journals were scattered everywhere. Then, without warning, the lantern went out. Darkness swallowed the room. Edward could no longer see his own hands. He reached for a match. Before he could move, a voice whispered directly beside his ear. "This is only the beginning." Then something cold breathed against the side of his neck. Edward could not move. His entire body became stiff. The cold breath remained against his neck, slowly moving closer, as if someone was standing only inches away. He tried to speak. No sound came out. His hands shook as he searched for another match. Finally, one struck. The tiny flame lit the lantern again. Light returned to the room. Nobody was there. Edward looked around desperately. Every corner was empty. The shattered urns still covered the floor. The journals remained scattered. Nothing had changed. He forced himself to breathe. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the stress was getting to me. He bent down to collect the broken pieces of the urn. Then he noticed something strange. The gray ashes were no longer lying where he had first seen them. They had formed a long trail across the floor, leading toward the far wall. Edward slowly followed it with the lantern. The trail ended beneath an old portrait hanging crooked on the wall. As he reached for the painting, a loud knock echoed from behind him. One knock, then another, very slow, very heavy. Edward turned around. Nobody stood at the doorway. The knocking continued, but now he realized it was not coming from the door. It was coming from inside the walls. 3 slow knocks. Silence. 3 more knocks. Silence. The sound moved around the room, first behind him, then above him, then beneath the wooden floor. Edward backed toward the exit. His breathing became faster. Suddenly every sound stopped. The silence felt even worse. He hurried into the hallway. The moment he stepped outside the room, the lantern flickered again. A dark shadow stretched across the opposite wall. It was much taller than any human. Its head almost touched the ceiling. 2 long arms hung motionless at its sides. Edward stared in horror. The shadow did not belong to him. There was nobody standing in front of the lantern. Yet the shadow remained, slowly growing larger, as if whatever created it was walking closer. Edward stumbled backward. His foot slipped. Before he could recover, something invisible struck him across the face with terrifying force. The impact threw him against the hallway wall. The lantern crashed onto the floor. Glass shattered. The flame died instantly. Darkness returned. Edward tried to stand. Sharp burning pain shot through both of his hands. He screamed. It felt as though dozens of hot needles were being driven into his skin. Then the same whisper returned, much clearer this time. "You touched what never belonged to you. Now you will remember." The voice stopped. Everything became silent again. The next morning, the warehouse workers arrived just after sunrise. They knocked on the front door. No answer. They called Edward's name. Nothing. After several minutes, they forced the door open. The entire warehouse stood empty. Papers were scattered across the office. Broken glass covered the hallway. Following the trail, the workers reached the hidden room. And there, lying unconscious on the floor, was Edward. His face was swollen. A deep hand-shaped bruise covered one side of his cheek. But what terrified everyone even more were his hands. Several strange black metal spikes had been driven straight through his palms. One of them was the exact same spike he had taken from the clay doll 4 days earlier. The workers rushed Edward back to the Whitmore house. Within minutes, the entire family gathered around him. Daniel called the town doctor. Robert stayed beside his younger brother. Victor never took his eyes off the black spike. His hands trembled the moment he saw it. The doctor carefully removed every spike from Edward's hands. None of the wounds made sense. The metal had pierced straight through both palms, yet no major bones were broken. It looked almost impossible. After cleaning the wounds and wrapping both hands, the doctor quietly admitted, "I have never seen injuries like these before." Edward remained unconscious until late afternoon. When he finally opened his eyes, everyone surrounded his bed. Robert leaned forward. "Edward, tell us what happened." For several seconds, Edward simply stared at the ceiling. His face had turned completely pale. Then he slowly began speaking. I heard someone standing behind me. I never saw anyone, but I know I was not alone. He described everything. The broken urns, the whisper, the giant shadow, the invisible slap, the unbearable pain in his hands. Everyone listened without interrupting. Then Edward lowered his voice. There is one thing I did not tell anyone. When I was lying on the floor, unable to move, someone knelt beside me. I could not see the face, but I heard every word. The room became completely silent. Edward repeated the exact sentence. You were warned. You disturbed what was never yours. These wounds will remind you to never steal from the dead again. Victor suddenly closed his eyes. A single tear rolled down his face. Daniel noticed it immediately. Uncle, you know exactly what that means. Victor did not answer. George finally spoke. Enough. Tomorrow we will bring someone who understands these things. Robert looked confused. You mean a priest? George slowly shook his head. Number. Someone much older. Someone who knows what has been trapped inside that house. Daniel still refused to believe any of it. This is ridiculous. Someone attacked Edward. That is all. We will hire guards. Search every inch of that mansion. We will find whoever is hiding there. Victor looked directly into Daniel's eyes. There is no one hiding there. That answer stayed with everyone. The following evening, just before sunset, Victor prepared to leave the house. Robert stopped him. Where are you going? Victor replied quietly. To lock the warehouse. Nobody remembered doing it after bringing Edward home. Robert immediately offered to go with him. Victor refused. Number. I will be back soon. Stay here with your family. Those were the last words anyone ever heard from him. Because Victor Whitmore never returned home that night. Night slowly covered Black Hollow. 1 hour passed, then another. The family waited quietly. Everyone believed Victor had simply stayed behind to check the warehouse. But when the old grandfather clock struck midnight, George stood up. Something is wrong. Victor never stays out this late. Daniel grabbed his truck keys. Robert Samuel Thomas and several workers joined him. Together they drove toward the Hawthorne estate. The road felt unusually silent. Even the insects had stopped making noise. When they reached the mansion, the front gate stood wide open. Nobody remembered leaving it that way. Robert called Victor's name. Only his own voice echoed back. The front door was unlocked. Every room inside was empty. The office still looked exactly as Edward had left it. Nothing had been moved. Daniel searched every hallway. Samuel checked the basement. Thomas searched the upper floor. No sign of Victor. Then one of the workers shouted from outside. Everyone ran toward the courtyard. The moment Robert stepped outside, his legs froze. Standing beneath the massive dead oak tree hung Victor Whitmore. His body swayed gently in the cold wind. His own belt had been wrapped around his neck. His shoes were missing. His feet hung only inches above the ground. George collapsed to his knees. Daniel climbed the tree with the workers. Together they lowered Victor's body. Robert immediately noticed something horrifying. Victor's wrists were deeply cut, as if someone had sliced them before hanging him. His face was covered with bruises. Several ribs appeared broken. There were dark fingerprints around his throat, much larger than any normal human hand. Daniel clenched his fists. This was murder. Someone did this. But Robert was no longer looking at Victor. He was staring at the oak tree. Fresh scratches covered the bark. They formed strange symbols. Symbols none of them had ever seen before. At that exact moment, a cold wind passed through the courtyard. Every lantern around them went out together. Complete darkness surrounded the family. From somewhere inside the mansion, a slow wooden door creaked open. Then, for only a single second, Robert saw someone standing in the upstairs window. A tall figure, watching every one of them. The next blink, it was gone. Nobody else had seen it, or at least, nobody admitted they had. When they finally carried Victor's body back home, the entire Whitmore family was destroyed. There was no longer any doubt. Whatever had awakened inside the Hawthorne estate had claimed its second victim, and it was only getting started. Victor's funeral took place 3 days later. Nearly everyone in Black Hollow attended. People remembered him as a quiet man, a man who had spent his entire life helping others. No one could understand why such a gentle person would die so violently. Only the Whitmore family knew the truth, or at least, they thought they did. After the funeral, George gathered all 5 brothers inside Charles Whitmore's old study. He locked the door before speaking. His hands would not stop shaking. Listen to me carefully. From this moment on, no one enters the Hawthorne estate after sunset. No one touches anything left inside that hidden room. And no one speaks about Victor's death outside this family. Daniel slammed his hand onto the table. Enough. First Edward, now Victor. Someone is using these ghost stories to scare us. I will not shut down our business because of fear. George looked at him with exhausted eyes. You still believe this is about business? Daniel answered without hesitation. Yes, someone wants our land. Someone wants our money. That is all. Robert stayed silent. Deep inside, he no longer believed that. Later that evening, the family shared dinner together for the first time since Victor's funeral. No one talked much. The house felt heavy. Every sound made everyone look over their shoulder. Edward's hands were still wrapped in thick bandages. Even lifting a spoon caused him pain. As the family finished eating, Edward suddenly looked toward Daniel. Why are you holding my shoulder? Daniel frowned. I am not even standing near you. Edward slowly turned around. There was no one behind him. He forced a weak smile. Maybe I imagined it. Everyone tried to ignore the moment. Soon afterward, they all went to bed. Around 2 in the morning, Robert woke up needing a drink of water. The hallway outside his room was completely dark. As he walked toward the kitchen, he noticed the back door standing slightly open. A cold wind drifted inside. Robert stepped into the backyard. Moonlight covered the old stone well. At first everything looked normal. Then he saw someone sitting beside the well. It was Edward. His back faced Robert. He was crouched low. His shoulders moved slowly, as though he was whispering to someone. Robert called his name. Edward did not answer. Robert walked closer. Edward, what are you doing out here? Still no reply. Only soft whispering. Robert finally placed his hand on Edward's shoulder. The whispering stopped instantly. For a few seconds, everything became completely silent. Then Edward grabbed Robert's wrist with terrifying strength. Without turning around, he spoke. But it was not Edward's voice. It was deep, ancient, filled with hatred. I heard you the first time. Why do you keep disturbing me? Robert felt every hair on his body stand up. Slowly, Edward turned his head. His eyes were completely black, and a smile spread across his face. One that no human should ever be able to make. Edward whispered, "Leave him with me, or your fate will be exactly like Victor's." Then, without warning, he stood up, still holding Robert's wrist, and lifted him completely off the ground with one hand. Robert struggled to breathe. Edward held him in the air as if he weighed nothing. His injured hands were still wrapped in bandages, yet his grip felt stronger than steel. Robert clawed at Edward's arm. He could barely speak. "Edward, stop, please." The thing wearing Edward's face smiled even wider. "You still call him your brother. He has been listening to me for days." Robert felt his vision beginning to fade. Just then, the back door burst open. Daniel, Samuel, Thomas, and their wives rushed outside after hearing the noise. George came running behind them. The moment George saw Edward, his face turned white. He reached beneath his shirt, pulled out a small silver cross hanging from a leather cord, and pressed it against Edward's forehead. The reaction was immediate. Edward screamed, a sound so unnatural that everyone covered their ears. He released Robert, who crashed onto the ground gasping for air. Edward stumbled backward. His entire body shook violently. Then he collapsed unconscious beside the well. Nobody moved. Nobody dared touch him. For nearly a minute, the backyard remained completely silent. Finally, Robert forced himself to stand. His neck already showed dark finger marks. Daniel stared at him. What happened? Robert could barely answer. That was not Edward. George looked toward the old well. His eyes filled with fear. It has begun. Daniel grabbed George's arm. Enough secrets. Tell us everything. Right now. George remained silent for several moments, then slowly nodded. Tomorrow morning, I will tell you the truth. The truth your father took to his grave. The truth Victor spent his entire life trying to hide. The truth about the Hawthorne family, and why that mansion was never supposed to belong to us. No one slept that night. Every member of the Whitmore family stayed together until sunrise. Edward remained unconscious the entire night. Sometimes his lips moved, as though he was quietly speaking to someone no one else could hear. Just before dawn, he suddenly opened his eyes, looked directly at George, and smiled. Then in that same ancient voice he whispered, "You are already too late." He remembers everything now. The room fell silent. George slowly closed his eyes, because he understood exactly what those words meant. And for the first time in decades, he realized the spirit was no longer trapped inside the Hawthorne estate. It had entered the Whitmore family home itself. Morning arrived, but no one felt relieved. The Whitmore house had become completely silent. No one wanted to be alone. Every family member stayed within sight of the others. Edward finally woke up. He remembered nothing after entering the hidden room, nothing after hearing the whisper, nothing after waking beside the shattered urns. When Robert asked about the night near the well, Edward looked completely confused. "I never left my bedroom." Robert said nothing. He simply looked at the deep bruises around his own neck. George entered the dining room carrying an old wooden box. The box looked older than anyone in the family. Its corners were reinforced with black iron. He placed it on the table, took a deep breath, then slowly opened it. Inside were several faded photographs, old land deeds, handwritten journals, and one sealed envelope. The front of the envelope carried only 3 words: "Never open again." George stared at it for several seconds, then carefully broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter. The paper had almost turned brown with age. George unfolded it with trembling hands. This letter was written by your father, Charles Whitmore, only a few days before he died. He ordered me never to show it to anyone, unless the Hawthorne house was ever opened again. Daniel's face became serious. George began reading. "If you are hearing these words, then my sons have ignored every warning I ever gave. Everything happening to this family is our fault, not because of anything you have done, but because of what our bloodline stole many years ago." Robert slowly looked up. George continued, "The Hawthorne family never abandoned that estate. They were destroyed, and the story everyone believed was a lie created by our own family. Charles wrote that his father and 2 uncles had committed terrible crimes. They framed innocent people, stole land through deception, destroyed reputations, and finally murdered the owners of the estate. Everything had been covered up. Every witness had either disappeared or had been paid to stay silent. After their deaths, a spiritual practitioner was secretly brought to the mansion. He performed a dangerous ritual, not to destroy the spirit, but to imprison it. The hidden room, the clay figure, the black spike, the sealed wall, everything had been created to keep the spirit trapped forever." George lowered the letter. Nobody spoke. Daniel slowly shook his head. "Number, this cannot be true." George silently handed him one of the old photographs. It showed 3 Whitmore men standing beside a large oak tree. At their feet, 2 fresh graves. Behind them, the Hawthorne mansion. Daniel turned the picture over. A handwritten date was written on the back, October 1927. His hands began shaking. Robert opened one of the old journals. Inside were dozens of handwritten pages. Each page described strange deaths, nightmares, unexplained illnesses, disappearances. Every event happened after someone entered the hidden room. Robert looked toward George. "Why did Uncle Victor never tell us all this?" George closed the wooden box. "Because your father believed. If none of you ever learned the truth, then none of you would ever be curious enough to reopen that room. The secret was supposed to die with us. Instead, it woke up again. Before anyone could speak, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Everyone jumped to their feet. It came from Edward's bedroom. They ran toward the staircase. The bedroom door stood wide open. Edward was gone. The window was open. Cold wind blew through the room. On the wall above the bed, someone had written 5 words, using fresh dark red blood. "The debt has returned unpaid." Robert ran to the open window. Edward was nowhere outside. The ground below showed no footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had climbed down. It was as if he had simply vanished. Daniel shouted for everyone to spread out. The brothers searched every room, every hallway, every closet. Nothing. George remained inside Edward's bedroom, his eyes fixed on the blood written across the wall. "The debt has returned unpaid," he whispered to himself. "It has started choosing." Robert heard those words. Choosing who? George slowly turned toward him. "The guilty are already dead. Now it will judge the blood that remains." Before Robert could ask another question, a terrified scream echoed from downstairs. Everyone rushed toward the living room. Edward stood there, barefoot, his clothes soaked with mud. No one understood how he had reached the first floor before them. Daniel grabbed his shoulders. "Where were you?" Edward looked completely confused. "I was asleep. Why is everyone staring at me?" Robert looked at Edward's feet. Fresh black dirt covered them, mixed with small gray ashes. George noticed it too. His face lost all color. Without saying a word, he knelt down, brushed away some of the dirt. Tiny white fragments fell onto the floor. They were pieces of burned bone. Nobody said anything. George immediately ordered everyone, "Wash his feet, burn those clothes, do not touch the ashes with your bare hands." One of the women carefully collected them using a metal shovel. The moment the ashes touched the shovel, the fireplace exploded. Flames shot across the room. Pictures fell from the walls. Windows shattered all at once. Everyone screamed. Then, just as suddenly, everything became quiet again. Only the sound of burning wood remained. George stared into the fire. Someone is inviting him inside. Daniel lost his patience. "Enough. We are calling the sheriff. This has gone too far." George grabbed Daniel's arm. "Number, if outsiders become involved, more innocent people will die." Daniel pulled away. "I do not care what you believe anymore. I am ending this today." He walked to the telephone, lifted the receiver. There was no dial tone, only heavy breathing. Very slow, very close. Daniel froze. Then a voice spoke through the receiver. I have been waiting for your family. For almost 40 years. The line went dead. Daniel slowly lowered the phone. For the first time, real fear appeared in his eyes. That evening, George finally made a decision. Tomorrow, they would travel deep into the mountains to meet the only man still alive, who knew how the spirit had been imprisoned the first time, because if he could not stop what had been unleashed, the Whitmore bloodline would end forever. Before sunrise, the entire Whitmore family gathered outside the house. No one wanted to leave, but everyone understood there were no other choices left. George carried the old wooden box. Inside were the journals, the faded photographs, the letter written by Charles, and the strange black spike Edward had taken from the clay figure. George wrapped the spike inside thick white cloth. He refused to touch it directly. Daniel started the truck. Robert sat beside George. Samuel, Thomas, and Edward followed in another vehicle. The mountain road stretched for miles. Dense pine forests surrounded them. The deeper they drove, the colder the air became. Almost 3 hours later, the road ended near an isolated wooden cabin. There was no electricity, no nearby homes, only silence. George stepped out first. He looked toward the cabin. If anyone can help us, it is the man living here. Robert asked quietly. Who is he? George answered. His name is Elias Mercer. 40 years ago, he helped seal whatever was trapped inside the Hawthorne estate. None of the brothers spoke. George knocked 3 times on the old wooden door. Nothing happened. He knocked again. A weak voice came from inside. Go away, George answered loudly. It is George Whitmore. The Hawthorne spirit has awakened again. For several seconds, there was complete silence. Then the door slowly opened. Standing inside was an old man with long white hair. His eyes immediately fell on the cloth wrapped around the black spike. His face turned pale. He whispered, Who removed it? George pointed toward Edward. Elias looked directly into Edward's eyes. How many days ago? Edward quietly answered. 8. The old man's shoulders dropped. He slowly stepped aside. Come inside. You have already lost too much time. The cabin smelled of dried herbs and old wood. Ancient books covered every shelf. Strange symbols had been carved into nearly every wall. Elias placed the wrapped spike onto a stone table. Without touching it, he looked at every member of the family, then spoke words none of them expected. You believe a ghost is hunting your family, but that is not what escaped. Robert frowned. Then what is it? Elias closed his eyes. What was imprisoned beneath that mansion was never fully human. The man who died there was innocent, but he did not return as the same soul. Hatred, pain, betrayal. They changed him into something much darker. Something that feeds on bloodlines instead of people. Daniel finally asked, Can it be destroyed? Elias slowly shook his head. Number. Only released, or imprisoned again. The room became silent. Then Elias looked toward Edward. When you removed the spike, you broke the final seal. From that moment, it no longer belonged to the mansion. It attached itself to the last person who touched it. Edward felt his heart stop. You mean, it is following me? Elias answered without hesitation. Number. It is living inside your shadow. At that exact moment, the fire burning inside the cabin suddenly went out. Every window slammed shut, and behind Edward, a second shadow slowly appeared on the wooden floor, one that did not belong to him. Everyone turned toward the floor. Edward's shadow stretched across the wooden planks, but beside it, another shadow slowly appeared. It was much taller. Its shoulders were unnaturally wide. Its fingers looked impossibly long, and although no one stood behind Edward, the second shadow moved exactly 1 step closer to him. Samuel stumbled backward. Robert could not take his eyes off it. Daniel whispered, What is that? Elias answered without fear, Do not look into its face. Everyone immediately looked away. Only Edward kept staring. His breathing became slower, almost peaceful. The second shadow slowly raised one hand. Edward raised his hand at the exact same moment. Every movement matched perfectly, as though they were becoming one. Elias suddenly threw a handful of gray powder into the fireplace. Blue flames burst upward. The second shadow instantly disappeared. Edward collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The room remained silent. After several seconds, Elias looked toward George. It has already marked him. There is very little time left. Robert helped Edward stand. His younger brother looked exhausted, almost as though something had drained all of his strength. Daniel finally asked the question everyone feared. What do we have to do? Elias walked toward one of the old bookshelves. He removed a thick leather journal, placed it on the table, and opened a page filled with strange handwritten symbols. Long ago, the spirit was imprisoned using 3 sacred bindings: the clay vessel, the black spike, and the ashes of the innocent couple. When the spike was removed, the first binding broke. When the urns shattered, the second binding broke. Robert slowly realized something. The ashes. They scattered across the floor. Elias nodded. Which means, only one binding remains. George looked confused. What is the final binding? Elias slowly closed the journal. The truth. Everyone stared at him. He continued, the spirit cannot be imprisoned again, until the truth is returned to the place where it was stolen. Daniel frowned. I do not understand. Elias walked toward the old wooden box George had brought. He picked up one faded photograph, then another. Finally he unfolded Charles Whitmore's letter. Your family confessed to each other, but they never confessed to the world. The Hawthorne name was never cleared. Their murder was never exposed. Their land was never returned. Their innocence was buried with them. As long as that lie survives, so will the spirit. The cabin fell silent. Robert quietly asked, if we reveal everything, will it leave Edward? Elias looked directly at him. Maybe, maybe not. Because justice delayed for 40 years always demands a higher price. Before anyone could speak again, a loud knock echoed from the cabin door. 3 slow knocks. Everyone froze. No one had driven up the mountain. No footsteps had been heard outside. Elias slowly turned pale. His voice barely escaped his lips. Do not open that door, because whatever is standing outside is no longer waiting for permission. The 3 knocks came again. Slow, heavy, patient. Nobody moved. The cabin had become so quiet that everyone could hear their own breathing. Daniel slowly reached for the shotgun hanging beside the fireplace. Elias immediately grabbed his arm. Do not use that. It will only make it angry. Another 3 knocks echoed through the cabin. This time the walls vibrated. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Edward stared at the front door. His face had become completely blank, almost as if he recognized whoever stood outside. Then, without saying a single word, he began walking toward the entrance. Robert quickly stepped in front of him. Where are you going? Edward answered softly. He came for me. The voice was calm, but it was not Edward's voice. It sounded much older, much colder. Samuel and Thomas immediately held Edward back. He did not struggle. He simply kept staring at the door. Then he smiled. A smile that made everyone in the cabin step backward. Elias quickly opened one of the ancient books. He began chanting in a language none of them understood. The candles around the room suddenly burst into flame. The knocking stopped. For one long second, everything was still. Then a loud scratching sound began. Something was dragging its nails across the outside wall. Slowly, moving around the entire cabin. The sound passed one window, then another, until it reached the wall directly behind Edward. Everyone turned. A deep cracking noise came from the wood. One long black fingernail slowly pushed through the wall. Then another. 5 long claws emerged from the timber, pulling downward, splitting the thick wooden logs apart. Daniel raised the shotgun anyway. The claws suddenly disappeared. Silence returned. Nobody dared breathe. Then, a child's laughter echoed from outside. Soft at first, then louder. Then it changed. The laugh became deeper, older, until it sounded like a grown man laughing directly outside the door. Edward suddenly spoke again. He says you cannot hide me forever. George closed his eyes. Who says that? Edward slowly turned toward him. The man whose home we stole. The room fell silent. Then Edward lifted his injured hands. The bandages around both palms began turning dark. Fresh blood slowly soaked through the cloth. Without anyone touching him, the black spike wrapped inside George's wooden box began rattling violently. The entire cabin shook. The old photographs flew off the table. Charles Whitmore's letter landed upside down on the floor. Elias picked it up. His eyes widened in horror. There was writing on the back. Writing that had never been there before. Only one sentence. I forgave the innocent, not the blood that followed them. Elias stared at the words for several seconds. His hands slowly began to shake. Robert stepped closer. What does it mean? Elias looked toward every member of the Whitmore family. It means we misunderstood everything, from the very beginning. George frowned. What are you saying? Elias placed the letter back on the table. For 40 years I believed the spirit wanted revenge against every Whitmore. But this message says something different. It already forgave those who never took part in the crime. Daniel looked confused. Then why are we being hunted? Elias turned toward him. Because someone among your bloodline is still carrying the original sin. Silence filled the cabin. Robert immediately spoke. That is impossible. Everyone involved died decades ago. Elias slowly shook his head. Not necessarily. Sometimes guilt is inherited. Sometimes it is hidden. Sometimes the truth survives through something left behind. George suddenly looked away. Robert noticed it immediately. Uncle, why did you look down? George did not answer. Instead, he slowly walked toward the window. Outside, the forest had become completely still. Not a single branch moved. Then George whispered, There is something I never told any of you. Daniel stepped forward. What? George closed his eyes. Your father did not discover the truth after the murders. He already knew it before they happened. Nobody spoke. Robert felt his heartbeat racing. George continued. Charles tried to stop his brothers. He begged them to leave the Hawthorne family alone. When they refused, he walked away. But he never reported them. He never warned the Hawthorne family. He stayed silent. Daniel whispered. Number. George nodded. Silence became his crime. Robert slowly realized why Charles had lived with fear until the day he died. He had not been afraid of dying. He had been afraid of judgment. Before anyone could speak again, Edward suddenly stood up. His eyes remained closed. He slowly walked toward the center of the cabin. His feet moved unnaturally, almost as if someone invisible were guiding him. Then he stopped, raised one hand, and pointed directly at George. When he spoke, the voice no longer sounded human. The silent one was never the one I came for. Everyone stared at George. Then Edward's arm slowly lowered and pointed at someone else. Daniel? The room became completely silent. Edward opened his eyes. They were completely black. He smiled and whispered, Your father left you something. He buried it, exactly where mine was buried first. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. What did you just say? Edward did not answer. He simply kept staring. Then his body collapsed onto the wooden floor. The blackness disappeared from his eyes. He looked around in confusion. Why is everyone looking at me? Nobody replied. Elias slowly walked toward Daniel. Did your father ever leave you a map? A key? Anything before he died? Daniel stood completely still. At first he shook his head. Then something flashed across his mind. His expression changed. Robert noticed it immediately. You remembered something? Daniel looked at George. When father died, he gave me a small metal box. He said I should never open it unless our family faced a darkness that money could not fix. George closed his eyes. Charles knew this day would come. Daniel continued. I locked the box inside my office safe. I never even looked inside. Elias spoke without hesitation. Then we leave now. Whatever is inside that box may be the only reason your father believed your family still had a chance. Within minutes everyone was back in the trucks. The drive home felt much longer than before. Nobody spoke. Every person kept looking into the mirrors, as if expecting another vehicle to appear behind them. But the road remained empty. When they finally reached the Whitmore office, the sun had already begun to set. Daniel unlocked the building. Everything inside looked normal. His office was exactly as he had left it. He walked to the large steel safe hidden behind an old painting. After turning the combination, the heavy door slowly opened. Inside sat a small black metal box, covered in dust. Daniel carefully lifted it out. The lid carried only one sentence. For my eldest son, open only when the past returns. Daniel placed the box on the desk. His hands trembled as he unlocked it. Inside were three things: a silver key, a folded map, and an old leather notebook. Robert immediately opened the notebook. The first page was written in Charles Whitmore's handwriting. If this book has been opened, then the spirit has escaped. Do not trust the mansion. Do not trust the shadows. And above all, do not trust the person who begins hearing whispers. Everyone slowly looked toward Edward. He lowered his head, ashamed. Robert continued reading. There is one place beneath the Hawthorne estate. Even my brothers never found it. The true burial chamber lies below the old chapel, hidden beneath the stone floor. Inside that chamber rests the final proof of what my family did. If the truth is ever to be restored, that place must be opened. Elias suddenly grabbed the notebook. His eyes widened. The map? Show me the map. Daniel unfolded it across the desk. It showed the entire Hawthorne estate, but beneath the drawing of the mansion, a second level had been sketched. A hidden underground chamber, one that had never appeared on any official record. Elias whispered, This changes everything. Robert frowned. Why? Elias pointed to a small symbol drawn beside the underground room. Because this is not where the spirit was imprisoned. This is where the real bodies were hidden. Silence filled the office. Then, a loud metallic bang echoed from the hallway. Everyone rushed outside. The front door of the office was still locked. No one had entered, yet lying in the middle of the hallway was the silver key that had been inside the box only seconds earlier. Someone, or something, had already taken it, and the office door had never opened once. Everyone froze. Daniel looked back at the open box. The key was gone. Robert slowly bent down and picked up the silver key from the hallway. It was freezing cold, so cold that his fingers instantly became numb. Elias shouted, Do not touch it. Robert dropped the key onto the floor. A dark burn mark remained on his palm. Samuel stared in disbelief. How did it leave the box? Nobody answered. George slowly walked toward the hallway. There were no footprints, no broken windows, no open doors, nothing. Only the silver key lying alone on the wooden floor. Elias wrapped the key inside a white cloth, then looked at the family. "It wants us to find the chamber," Daniel asked. "Why would it help us?" Elias replied, "Because whatever is buried down there, even it cannot reach." Robert frowned. "You mean the spirit is searching for something too?" Elias nodded. "For decades it has only been able to roam the mansion. It cannot enter the chamber beneath the chapel. Something stronger is keeping it out." The room became silent. George finally spoke. "Then we go tonight." Nobody argued. An hour later, the family stood once again outside the abandoned Hawthorne estate. The mansion looked even darker than before. Broken windows reflected the moonlight. The wind carried the smell of wet soil and decay. Edward suddenly stopped walking. He whispered, "It knows we are here." Almost immediately, a church bell echoed through the valley. 1, 2, 3. There was no church anywhere near the estate. Yet the sound continued, slow, heavy, ancient. Elias looked toward the old chapel standing behind the mansion. That bell has not rung in 40 years. Daniel tightened his grip on the flashlight. They crossed the overgrown courtyard. The chapel door was hanging open. Inside, everything was covered in dust. Broken wooden benches lay scattered across the floor. At the center stood a cracked stone altar. According to the map, the entrance should be beneath it. George and Samuel pushed the altar together. It barely moved. With one final effort, the heavy stone scraped aside, revealing a rusted iron ring fixed into the floor. Robert pulled it upward. A hidden stone hatch slowly opened. A wave of icy air rushed out. It smelled like damp earth. And something far worse. A narrow staircase disappeared into complete darkness. Elias lit an old lantern. "Flashlights will fail down there. Stay close. No one walks alone." One by one, they descended into the underground passage. The stone walls were covered with strange symbols. Some had been scratched away. Others looked freshly carved. After several minutes, the tunnel opened into a massive underground chamber. In the center stood a single wooden coffin, wrapped tightly in heavy iron chains. Around it, dozens of melted candles formed a perfect circle. Nobody moved. Then Robert noticed something that made his heart stop. The chains around the coffin were already broken, as if someone had opened it. Robert slowly stepped closer. The broken chains lay scattered across the stone floor. Some looked rusted with age. Others looked freshly snapped. Daniel pointed his flashlight toward the coffin. The lid was slightly open, only a few inches, as though someone had climbed out, or climbed in. Elias raised his lantern. "Nobody touches it." Nobody answered. The entire chamber felt unnaturally cold. Their breath turned white. Edward suddenly grabbed his own head. He fell to his knees. "Stop. Please stop talking." Robert rushed toward him. "Who is talking?" Edward pressed both hands against his ears. "He is. He keeps saying we are too late." George looked around the chamber. There was nobody else. Only silence. Then, a slow dripping sound echoed through the darkness. Drop, drop, drop. Samuel lifted the lantern higher. Red liquid was falling from the ceiling. Not water. Blood. Fresh blood. It landed beside the coffin. One drop after another. Daniel looked upward. The stone ceiling was completely dry. There was nothing above them. Yet the blood kept falling. Elias whispered, "Do not look at it. Keep your eyes on the floor." The dripping suddenly stopped. The silence became unbearable. Robert slowly reached the coffin. He pushed the lid another inch. Inside, there was no body. Only an old leather satchel. And beneath it, a human skeleton. Its wrists were still tied together with iron wire. George covered his mouth. "That cannot be Charles." Elias shook his head. "Number. These bones are much older." Robert carefully lifted the leather satchel. Inside were dozens of yellowed documents. Land deeds, court papers, handwritten confessions. Every page carried the official seal of Hawthorne County. Daniel unfolded the largest document. His hands began trembling. This was the original property record. The Hawthorne family had never legally sold their estate. It had been stolen through forged signatures. George whispered, "Then everything we built, everything we owned, was never ours." Before anyone could speak, a loud slam echoed through the chamber. The stone hatch above them had just closed. Samuel ran toward the staircase. It would not move. They were trapped. The lantern flame suddenly turned blue. Edward slowly stood up. His eyes were closed again. He smiled, then pointed toward the far end of the chamber, hidden inside the darkness. A tall figure slowly stepped forward. Its face remained invisible, but everyone recognized the long black coat, the same coat from the old photographs. The figure stopped beside the empty coffin, then spoke in a calm voice. "You finally found my grave. Now find the man who is still alive." Nobody breathed. The last words echoed across the underground chamber. The man who is still alive. Robert stared at the figure. That is impossible. Everyone involved died decades ago. The figure did not move. Its face remained hidden beneath the darkness. Then it slowly lifted one arm, pointing toward George. Every eye turned to him. George stepped backward. Number. Do not look at me. Elias spoke quietly. Who is still alive? The figure answered. Not the murderer. The witness. George's hands began shaking. Daniel looked at him. Uncle, what is it hiding? George closed his eyes. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then tears rolled down his face. I never wanted any of you to know. Robert stepped closer. Know what? George took a deep breath. My father Charles did not tell me everything before he died. He gave me one last name. One man who helped your great uncles murder the Hawthorne family. He survived. He disappeared. And he changed his identity. Samuel whispered. Who? George looked toward the empty coffin. His name was Victor Hale. He was the foreman who worked for our family. He forged the land records, buried the evidence, helped hide the bodies, and vanished before anyone suspected him. Daniel frowned. That was 40 years ago. He would be very old now. George nodded slowly. If he is alive, he is nearly 90. Robert looked at the spirit. Is that why you brought us here? The figure gave a slow nod. Justice was never finished. The innocent were buried. The guilty escaped. The lantern suddenly flickered. The spirit slowly began fading into the darkness. Before disappearing, it spoke one final sentence. Find Victor, before the next full moon, or the last Whitmore will die. The chamber instantly became silent. At the same moment, a loud grinding sound echoed above them. The stone hatch slowly opened by itself. Fresh night air rushed into the chamber. Elias grabbed the leather satchel. Take every document. Leave nothing behind. They climbed out as quickly as they could. The moment the last person reached the chapel, the hatch slammed shut again, as if it had never existed. Outside, the wind had completely stopped. The estate stood in total silence. Robert looked down at the old property records in his hands. One folded page slipped out. It was newer than all the others, typed instead of handwritten. Across the top was a business letterhead. Hale Mining Corporation. Below it was an address, not abandoned, not historical, a currently operating company. And at the bottom of the page, a signature, Victor Hale. Early the next morning, before the sun rose, two vehicles left the Whitmore house. Robert drove the first truck. Daniel sat beside him. George, Elias, Samuel, Thomas, and Edward followed behind. Nobody spoke during the journey. Every mile brought them closer to Black Ridge. According to the documents, Hale Mining Corporation operated from an old industrial property hidden deep inside the hills. 3 hours later, they reached a rusted iron gate. A weathered metal sign still hung above it. Hale Mining Corporation. The buildings looked abandoned. Broken windows, collapsed storage sheds, rust covered every machine. Yet one thing felt wrong. Fresh tire tracks covered the muddy entrance. Someone had arrived recently. Daniel quietly said, "He is here." They entered the property. The main office building stood at the center. Its front door was unlocked. Inside, everything was spotless. The furniture looked new. The lights worked perfectly. It felt as though someone had been expecting them. A faint smell of coffee drifted through the hallway. Robert whispered, "Someone was here only minutes ago." They followed the hallway until they reached a large office. The chair behind the desk slowly turned toward them. An elderly man sat there, neatly dressed, white hair, sharp blue eyes. His face showed no fear. He calmly smiled. "I was beginning to think you would never come." Nobody needed an introduction. Everyone already knew. Victor Hale. Daniel stepped forward. "You murdered innocent people." Victor smiled again. "Number. I simply worked for powerful men." George threw Charles' old notebook onto the desk. "Enough lies. Tell them everything." Victor looked at the notebook, then laughed quietly. Charles always had a guilty conscience. That was his weakness. Robert clenched his fists. "Because of you, our family has been cursed for decades." Victor leaned back. "Your family cursed itself. Greed always collects its payment." Elias interrupted. "The Hawthorne spirit has returned." Victor stopped smiling. For the first time, fear crossed his face. "So, it finally escaped." The room fell silent. Victor slowly opened a desk drawer. Everyone tensed, but instead of a weapon, he removed an old black and white photograph. It showed the Hawthorne family standing outside their home. On the back was one handwritten sentence. "He never forgave me." Victor looked directly at Robert. "You believe I escaped justice. You are wrong. I have lived every single day waiting for him to come." Then Victor slowly rolled up his left sleeve. Deep across his forearm was the exact same strange burn mark, the one Robert received after touching the silver key. Victor whispered, "He found me years ago, and every night since then, he has been counting down. Today, he finally stops waiting." At that exact moment, the office lights exploded, every window shattered, and from somewhere deep beneath the building, a slow familiar voice echoed upward. "Victor, I have come home." The office went completely dark. Glass covered the floor. The only light came from Ilias's lantern. Victor slowly stood from his chair. For the first time in decades, the old man looked terrified. He whispered, "He found me." Daniel grabbed Victor by the collar. "You are not running anywhere." Victor laughed weakly. "You still do not understand. If I die before telling the truth, it will never end." Robert looked toward Elias. "What is happening?" Elias answered, "The spirit is no longer hunting. It is judging." A deep rumble shook the entire building. Dust poured from the ceiling. Somewhere below them, heavy footsteps echoed. 1, 2, 3. Each step sounded closer. Victor pointed toward a steel door at the back of the office. "The tunnels. He is coming through the old mining tunnels." George stared at him. "There are tunnels beneath this place." Victor nodded. "I built them. After the murders, I moved everything here." Robert frowned. "Everything?" Victor lowered his head. "The missing evidence, the murder weapons, the forged records, even the rope. Everything was hidden underground." Daniel's face hardened. "Then you are coming with us." Victor shook his head. "Number, my time is over. You need the truth, not me." Another violent shake hit the building. The steel door suddenly burst open. A freezing wind rushed inside. The lantern flame turned deep blue. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a voice echoed through the tunnel. "Victor, come outside." Nobody could see who had spoken, yet every person felt the words inside their chest. Victor slowly closed his eyes. 40 years. I knew this day would arrive. He reached into his pocket and removed a small cassette tape. He handed it to Robert. "Everything is recorded. Every crime, every name, every lie. Take this to the police. Clear the Hawthorne family forever." Robert accepted the tape. Before anyone could stop him, Victor walked toward the open tunnel. Daniel shouted, "Do not go." Victor never looked back. Some debts can only be paid once. He disappeared into the darkness. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, a single scream echoed through the tunnels. It lasted only a moment. Then complete silence returned. The freezing wind stopped. The blue flame became normal again. Elias slowly removed his hat. "It is over." George looked toward the tunnel. "Is he dead?" Elias answered quietly, "Number, he has finally been judged." Just then, Edward suddenly collapsed. Robert rushed to him. The strange darkness beneath his eyes was gone. The burn marks on his hands had completely disappeared. He slowly opened his eyes, then smiled for the first time in days. I cannot hear him anymore. At that same moment, outside the office, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds. For the first time since this nightmare began, the air felt warm, but lying on Victor's empty office chair was one final handwritten note. There was no signature, only one sentence. "The truth frees the innocent, but it never forgives the guilty." 3 weeks later, the cassette tape was handed over to state investigators. Every confession matched the documents found beneath the Hawthorne estate. The forged land records, the murders, the stolen property. Everything was finally exposed. The Hawthorne family name was officially cleared. Their estate was declared stolen through fraud. Local newspapers called it the oldest hidden crime ever uncovered in Black Ridge County. The Whitmore family gave up every acre of land that had belonged to the Hawthornes. A memorial was built beside the old chapel. Instead of a mansion, only a garden remained. No one ever rebuilt the house. George visited the memorial every Sunday. He never missed a single week. Edward slowly recovered. The nightmares stopped. The whispers never returned. Even the strange burn marks disappeared without leaving a scar. Life slowly became normal again. Or at least, that was what everyone believed. Exactly 1 year later, Robert returned to the memorial alone. He placed fresh flowers beside the stone monument. The wind was calm. The forest was silent. For the first time, he felt peace. As he turned to leave, he noticed an elderly woman standing near the old chapel. She wore a simple white dress. Her face looked gentle. She smiled at Robert. "Thank you." Robert politely nodded. When he looked away for only a second, she was gone. There were no footprints, no sound, nothing. Only the flowers she had been standing beside now looked freshly watered. Robert quietly smiled. He finally understood. Not every spirit remains because of hatred. Some remain, only to wait for justice. And once justice is complete, even the darkest souls can finally rest. So this is the story. Follow Nightmare Files for more.